Hey guys, tonight we are talking about the fall of the Aztec Empire. Part 1, The World of the Aztecs. In the early 16th century, the Valley of Mexico was a vibrant world of towering temples, bustling marketplaces, and intricate canals. The Aztec Empire, also known as the Mexico Triple Alliance, stood as the most powerful state in Mesoamerica. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was a jewel of engineering and culture, an island city rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by massive causeways and dotted with gleaming temples that pierced the sky. The Aztecs were not an ancient civilization in the sense of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Their empire was relatively young, barely a century old by the time it reached its zenith. Yet, in that short time, they had created a society that blended military strength, advanced agricultural techniques, complex religious rituals, and a highly stratified political system. The empire extended over much of central and southern Mexico, collecting tribute from hundreds of city-states and subjugated peoples. However, beneath the apparent strength of this empire were tensions that would eventually prove fatal. Many of the conquered peoples despised Aztec rule, particularly their demands for tribute payments and human sacrifices. These simmering resentments would later play a critical role in the events that unfolded when a small band of foreign adventurers, led by Hernán Cortés, arrived on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico in 1519. Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec world, at the center of the Aztec universe was Tenochtitlan, founded in 1325 on an island in Lake Texcoco. By the early 16th century, it had grown into a metropolis of perhaps 200,000 to 250,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time, larger even than many European capitals such as London or Paris. Tenochtitlan was meticulously organized. Canals crisscrossed the city, functioning both as transportation routes and as part of an advanced water management system. Chinampas, or floating gardens, surrounded the island, allowing for intensive agricultural production that fed the city's growing population. The main ceremonial precinct was dominated by the Templo Mayor, a massive pyramid with twin shrines dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the rain god. Here, rituals and sacrifices were performed to ensure the continuation of the cosmic order. Markets, such as the one in Tlatelolco, impressed even the Spanish chroniclers with their size and organization. Everything from food to luxury goods, feathers, cacao, obsidian tools, and fine textiles could be found in these vibrant trading centers. Religion and human sacrifice. Aztec religion was deeply intertwined with every aspect of life, including politics and warfare. The Aztecs believed that the universe was fragile and constantly at risk of destruction. To sustain the sun and ensure the survival of the world, they offered the hearts and blood of human captives to the gods. This practice, which horrified European observers, was not random cruelty but a central component of Aztec cosmology. Warfare itself, called flowery wars, was often waged, not just for territorial expansion, but to capture prisoners for sacrifice. This religious worldview both unified the Aztecs and alienated their neighbors. Conquered city-states often viewed Aztec rule as oppressive, not only due to the heavy tribute they were forced to pay, but also because of the demand for sacrificial victims. Political power and the Triple Alliance. The Aztec Empire was officially an alliance between three city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. In reality, Tenochtitlan held the dominant position. The ruler of Tenochtitlan, known as the Huitzilopochtli, wielded immense authority. By the early 1500s, this position was held by Montezuma II, a shrewd but deeply religious ruler. Montezuma presided over an empire that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific and from central Mexico into parts of modern-day Guatemala. The empire was maintained through a combination of military conquest, alliances, and the collection of tribute. However, it was not a fully centralized state. The Aztec political system depended on loyalty from local rulers, many of whom were reluctant or resentful subjects. Europe and the Age of Exploration. While the Aztec Empire was thriving in the early 1500s, Europe was entering the Age of Exploration. Following the voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1492, the Spanish crown sought new lands, wealth, and trade routes. Driven by the promise of gold, glory, and religious conversion, Spanish conquistadors began to explore the Caribbean and the mainland of the Americas. Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman from Spain, became one of the most ambitious and cunning of these adventurers. By 1519, he had already proven himself in campaigns in Cuba, but he hungered for more. Rumors of a wealthy and powerful kingdom inland filled with gold and strange customs reached him and fueled his determination to lead an expedition. A world on the brink. As 1519 dawned, the Aztec Empire seemed stable and prosperous. Montezuma, too, ruled from the magnificent palaces of Tenochtitlán. Tribute flowed in from across Mesoamerica. The marketplaces were filled with goods, and the temples were active with festivals and rituals. Yet cracks were already forming. Resentment among subject peoples was growing. Rival states such as Tlaxcala fiercely resisted Aztec domination. Natural disasters, famine, and omens, such as strange comets and the mysterious burning of the temple of Huitzilopochtli, were seen by some as signs that the gods were displeased. In this tense atmosphere, the arrival of the Spanish was not merely a shock but a world-altering event. The Aztecs had never encountered outsiders with such technology, ships, and weapons. Even more bewildering was the Spaniards' pale skin, beards, and strange animals, particularly the horses, which were unknown in the Americas. The collision of two worlds. When Cortés and his men landed on the coast of present-day Veracruz, they entered a world unlike any they had known. At first, they were just a small group of foreigners with little more than 600 soldiers, a few cannons, and a handful of horses. By all appearances, they were no threat to an empire of millions. Yet what followed over the next 2 years would defy all expectations. Through a combination of alliances, cunning diplomacy, bold military tactics, and sheer luck, Cortés and his indigenous allies managed to topple one of the most powerful civilizations in the Americas. The story of the fall of the Aztec Empire is not just a tale of Spanish conquest. It is a complex narrative involving indigenous resistance, betrayal, shifting alliances, and the devastating impact of disease. It is also a story of misinterpretation and misunderstanding, as both the Aztecs and the Spaniards tried to comprehend each other's worldviews. Why study the fall of the Aztec Empire? The conquest of the Aztec Empire was one of the most dramatic and consequential events in world history. It reshaped the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the Americas, paving the way for centuries of Spanish colonization. The destruction of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked the end of a civilization, but also the beginning of a new hybrid culture that would eventually evolve into modern Mexico. Studying this history allows us to see the clash of civilizations in all its complexity, how technological advantages, cultural misunderstandings, and internal divisions can decide the fate of nations. It also reveals how narratives of conquest are shaped, as much of what we know comes from the writings of the conquerors themselves, such as Bernal Diaz del Castillo and Cortés' own letters to King Charles V. The road ahead. This account will explore the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire in detail. It will examine not just the dramatic battles and political maneuvers, but also the deeper causes, social, economic, and cultural, that made the empire vulnerable. We will begin by understanding the origins and structure of Aztec society before moving on to the fateful encounters with Hernán Cortés and his allies. Part 2. The Rise of the Aztec Empire. To understand the dramatic fall of the Aztec Empire, we must first trace its remarkable rise. In less than 200 years, the Mexica people, once a small, nomadic tribe, transformed themselves into rulers of one of the most advanced and powerful civilizations in the Americas. Their success was built on adaptability, relentless military ambition, and a religious worldview that fused politics and spirituality into a single driving force. The origins of the Mexica: the Aztecs called themselves Mexica, a name that would later inspire the word Mexico. According to their own legends, recorded in codices and oral traditions, the Mexica originated in a mythical northern homeland called Aztlán, hence the name Aztec. Guided by their patron god Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica migrated southward over many generations, seeking a land where they were destined to build a great city. This journey was long and difficult. By the 13th century, the Mexica had entered the Valley of Mexico, a highland basin surrounded by mountains and dotted with lakes. At that time, the valley was already home to numerous powerful city-states, including Texcoco, Azcapotzalco, and Culhuacán. The Mexica, as newcomers and outsiders, found themselves unwelcome and often persecuted. According to legend, they were once enslaved by other groups and forced to work as mercenaries or farmers. The Mexica's reputation for fierce military skill gradually grew, and they began to play a role as hired warriors in the conflicts among established city-states. Their god Huitzilopochtli, a deity of war and the sun, demanded strength, sacrifice, and relentless expansion. The founding of Tenochtitlán, the pivotal moment in Mexica history, came in 1325, when they saw the prophesied sign of their god, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. This vision, said to have occurred on a small island in Lake Texcoco, convinced them they had found their promised land. There, they began building Tenochtitlan, which would become the heart of their empire. In its early years, Tenochtitlan was a humble settlement, but the Mexica adapted to the challenges of their environment. The swampy island forced them to develop ingenious agricultural techniques, including the creation of Chinampas, artificial islands made of mud, reeds, and organic matter. These floating gardens allowed for year-round farming and supported a growing population. The Triple Alliance, the Mexica's path to dominance, accelerated in the early 15th century. Initially, they were vassals of the Tepanic city-state of Azcapotzalco, ruled by the powerful king Cuauhtémoc. Under the leadership of the Mexica ruler Itzcoatl, Tenochtitlan rebelled against Tepanic domination. With the help of allies from Texcoco and Tlacopan, the Mexica overthrew Azcapotzalco in 1428. This victory marked the formation of the Triple Alliance, a political and military pact between the three cities. Although the alliance was theoretically equal, Tenochtitlan soon emerged as the dominant partner, largely because of its strategic location and military might. The Triple Alliance rapidly expanded through warfare, conquering city-states across the Valley of Mexico and beyond. Within a few decades, the Aztecs had extended their influence from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean. Aztec military power, the Aztec state was fundamentally a warrior society. Every able-bodied male citizen was expected to serve in the military, and success in war brought prestige, wealth, and social advancement. Capturing enemy warriors alive was considered more honorable than killing them outright, as captives could be sacrificed to the gods. The Aztec military used a combination of discipline, strategy, and intimidation. Their weapons included the macuatl, a wooden club edged with razor-sharp obsidian blades, spears and darts, bows and arrows, and protective cotton armor. Elite warriors, such as the Jaguar and Eagle Knights, were feared across Mesoamerica. Conquests were followed by the imposition of tribute demands on defeated states. These tributes included food, textiles, precious stones, cacao, and even human captives for sacrifice. This system enriched Tenochtitlan, but also created resentment among subjugated peoples. The reign of Montezuma I in the Golden Age, the fourth ruler of Tenochtitlan, Montezuma I, who ruled from 1440 to 1469, is often credited with transforming the Aztecs into a true empire. He expanded territory through a series of successful military campaigns and restructured the tribute system to ensure a steady flow of resources to the capital. Montezuma I also oversaw the construction of grand architectural projects, including the expansion of the Templo Mayor and the creation of aqueducts to bring fresh water to the island city. During his reign, Tenochtitlan became not only a political center, but also a cultural and religious hub. Society and daily life. Aztec society was highly hierarchical. At the top stood the Huey Tlatoani, the supreme ruler, who was seen as both a political leader and a semi-divine figure chosen by the gods. Below him were nobles, priests, warriors, and merchants, who often traveled long distances to trade luxury goods such as jade, turquoise, and tropical bird feathers. The majority of the population were Mi'kmaq, who worked the land, paid tribute, and served as soldiers when called upon. At the bottom of society were slaves, though Aztec slavery was not always permanent and was often a punishment for debt. Education was compulsory for all children, a remarkable feature of Aztec society. Boys were trained in warfare, farming, and trades, while girls learned domestic skills, weaving, and household management. Religious instruction and moral values were emphasized. Religion as the foundation of power. The Aztecs believed they lived in the fifth sun, the fifth era of the world, which could only continue through constant offerings to the gods. Among the most important deities were Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun; Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a god of wind, learning, and culture; Tlaloc, the rain god; Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate and sorcery. The priesthood wielded immense influence, organizing elaborate ceremonies, festivals, and sacrifices. The Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan was the center of religious life, where thousands of captives might be sacrificed during major events, such as the dedication of a new temple. The reign of Montezuma II. By the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire had reached its peak under Montezuma II. A devout and deeply cautious ruler, Montezuma expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, extending influence over more than 400 city-states and millions of people. However, Montezuma's reign also saw growing instability. The constant demands for tribute and sacrificial victims strained relationships with subject peoples. Many of these groups, such as the Tlaxcalans and the Totonacs, were fiercely independent and waiting for an opportunity to rebel against Aztec rule. Montezuma himself was troubled by a series of bad omens. According to later accounts, strange events such as the appearance of comets, the burning of temples, and mysterious visions were seen as warnings that something catastrophic was approaching. Whether these stories were later inventions or based on real events, they highlight a sense of unease in the Aztec world just before the arrival of the Spanish. The stage is set by 1519. The Aztec Empire was powerful but vulnerable. It controlled vast territories, but its rule depended on the loyalty or at least submission of many resentful city-states. Its religion inspired devotion among its own people, but fear and hatred among its neighbors. It was into this complex and volatile political landscape that Hernán Cortés would step, bringing with him new technologies, deadly diseases, and a ruthless determination to carve out a fortune and an empire for Spain. Part 3. The arrival of the Spanish and early encounters. The arrival of the Spanish in Mexico in 1519 marked a pivotal turning point in history. At first, the Aztecs knew nothing of the forces approaching their land's armed men from across the sea, riding strange beasts, wielding weapons of steel and fire. Hernán Cortés, the man who led this expedition, came not only with a thirst for gold, but also with the ambition to establish himself as a great conqueror. His arrival on the shores of Mexico would set off a chain of events that would forever change the fate of the Aztec Empire. Hernán Cortés and his ambitions. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in the Spanish town of Medellin in the province of Extremadura. As a young man, he sailed to the Americas, first arriving in Hispaniola and later participating in the conquest of Cuba. There, he earned a reputation as a skilled leader and a bold, resourceful soldier. By 1518, Cortés had become restless. He had heard rumors of wealthy civilizations on the mainland of the Americas, with cities filled with gold and treasures. When he was appointed to lead an expedition to the Mexican coast, Cortés saw his chance to achieve fame and fortune. However, his superior, the Cuban governor Diego Velázquez, grew suspicious of Cortés' ambitions and tried to cancel the expedition. Cortés ignored the orders and sailed anyway, effectively acting as a rogue commander. The Spanish landing on the Gulf Coast in February 1519, Cortés landed on the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula with roughly 600 soldiers, 16 horses, several small cannons, and a few ships. Though his force was small, Cortés understood the importance of strategy, diplomacy, and psychological warfare. His first encounters were with the Maya peoples of the Yucatan. The Maya city-states were not united, and some groups were hostile, while others were willing to negotiate. Cortés' forces fought several skirmishes, but eventually secured the loyalty of local groups who saw the Spanish as potential allies against their rivals. The gift of La Malinche. Among the gifts offered to the Spanish after early conflicts were a group of enslaved women. One of these women would become one of the most significant figures in the conquest. Malintzin, also known as La Malinche or Dona Marina. Fluent in both Nahuatl and the Mayan dialects, Malintzin quickly became Cortés' interpreter and advisor. Her linguistic skills allowed Cortés to communicate with the peoples of central Mexico, but her role went far beyond that of a translator. Malintzin understood the politics of the region and advised Cortés on forming alliances. To this day, her legacy remains controversial. Some see her as a traitor to her people, while others view her as a survivor and mediator in a time of unprecedented upheaval. The march toward Mexico. From the Yucatan, Cortés sailed northward and landed on the coast of present-day Veracruz. It was here that he took a decisive and symbolic step. He scuttled his ships, preventing any possibility of retreat. This bold act forced his men to commit entirely to the expedition, as there was no turning back. Cortés soon made contact with the Totonac people, who lived under Aztec rule and paid heavy tribute to Tenochtitlán. The Totonacs resented Aztec dominance and quickly allied with the Spanish. Cortés used diplomacy and intimidation to solidify these alliances, promising freedom from Aztec oppression in exchange for military support. The Aztec response to the strangers. News of the strange foreigners spread rapidly through the Aztec world. Messengers carried word to Montezuma II in Tenochtitlan, describing men with pale skin, beards, and clothing unlike anything seen before. Even more startling were the Spanish horses, which the Aztecs initially thought were magical creatures combining man and beast. Montezuma was deeply troubled by these reports. Some accounts suggest that he believed the Spanish might be linked to the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent deity who, according to certain prophecies, was destined to return from the east. Whether Montezuma truly believed this or simply saw the Spaniards as a potential divine omen is debated by historians, but his initial response was cautious. Rather than confront Cortés directly, Montezuma sent emissaries with lavish gifts, including gold, silver, and precious feathers. The Spanish were dazzled by the wealth, but these gifts had the opposite effect of what Montezuma intended. They only fueled Cortés' desire to march on Tenochtitlan. The encounter with the Tlaxcalans, As Cortes advanced inland, he entered the territory of the Tlaxcalans, a fierce and independent confederation of city-states. The Tlaxcalans were bitter enemies of the Aztecs, who had repeatedly tried to subjugate them but had failed due to Tlaxcala's strategic defenses and warrior culture. Initially, the Tlaxcalans saw the Spanish as invaders and fought several fierce battles against them. The Spaniards' steel weapons, horses, and firearms gave them a decisive edge, and the Tlaxcalans suffered heavy losses. Eventually, recognizing that they could not defeat the Spanish, the Tlaxcalans offered an alliance. This alliance would prove critical to the conquest. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors joined Cortes, swelling his ranks and providing invaluable knowledge of the local terrain and Aztec tactics. The massacre at Cholula, Cortes' march continued with both diplomacy and violence. In the city of Cholula, a sacred and wealthy city allied with the Aztecs, the Spanish claimed to have uncovered a plot to ambush them. Whether this plot truly existed is uncertain, but Cortes acted ruthlessly. He ordered a surprise attack, and his forces, aided by their indigenous allies, massacred thousands of unarmed Cholulans in a single day. This act of terror sent shockwaves through the region. For the Aztecs and their allies, it was a stark warning of Spanish brutality. For some city-states, it was also a sign that resistance against Cortes could be fatal, and many chose to submit rather than fight. The march to Tenochtitlan by late 1519, Cortes' force, now consisting of a few hundred Spaniards and tens of thousands of indigenous allies, was approaching the Valley of Mexico. The journey to Tenochtitlan was breathtaking for the Europeans. As they descended from the high mountains and saw the sprawling valley below, they were awestruck by the beauty of the lakes, the fertile fields, and, most of all, the magnificent city that seemed to float on water. Cortes later described Tenochtitlan as equal to, if not greater than, the cities of Europe. The causeways leading to the island city, the canals filled with canoes, the towering pyramids, and the bustling marketplaces all impressed the Spaniards. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortes' army, wrote in his memoirs that they could hardly believe what they were seeing. The meeting of Cortes and Montezuma on November 8, 1519. Hernán Cortés and Montezuma II met for the first time at the entrance to Tenochtitlan. The meeting was a carefully choreographed affair. Montezuma, dressed in magnificent robes and adorned with gold and precious stones, was carried on a litter by his attendants. Cortes, riding a horse and wearing steel armor, presented himself with equal pomp. Accounts of their meeting vary, but most agree that Montezuma welcomed Cortes with courtesy, offering gifts and inviting him into the city. Some historians believe that Montezuma's actions were driven by a strategy of diplomacy. He hoped to understand these foreigners and perhaps use them to his advantage. Others argue that Montezuma was hesitant and indecisive, unsure how to deal with these strange visitors. The Spaniards in the capital, Cortes and his men were given quarters in one of Montezuma's palaces. For several days, they explored the city, marveling at its size, cleanliness, and organization. Tenochtitlan had wide streets, bustling markets, aqueducts, and even waste management systems that impressed the Europeans. But beneath this veneer of hospitality, tensions were growing. The Spanish were fascinated by the wealth of the city, particularly its gold. They also disapproved of Aztec religious practices, especially human sacrifice, which they viewed as barbaric and demonic. Cortes began to fear that Montezuma might turn against him. Seizing Montezuma, in a daring and controversial move, Cortes decided to take Montezuma hostage. Using a pretext involving a skirmish between Spaniards and Aztec officials, Cortés and his men entered the palace, captured Montezuma, and held him under house arrest. Remarkably, Montezuma did not resist, and the city remained calm for the time being. This audacious act gave Cortes control of Tenochtitlan's political center. However, it also planted the seeds of future rebellion. The Aztecs would not tolerate foreign rule indefinitely, and the Spaniards' arrogance and hunger for gold were beginning to alienate their hosts. Part 4, From Peace to War. The first months of the Spanish presence in Tenochtitlan were marked by a tense and fragile coexistence. While Hernán Cortés and his men marveled at the city's splendor and riches, their ambitions for power and gold quickly strained the delicate diplomacy with Montezuma too. Suspicion and hostility grew between the Spaniards and the Aztecs, setting the stage for a violent clash that would erupt into open warfare. The Spanish strategy, by holding Montezuma hostage, Cortés effectively controlled the Aztec political structure, at least on the surface. He compelled Montezuma to act as a puppet ruler, ordering his subjects to obey the Spaniards' demands. Through intimidation and persuasion, the Spaniards extracted gold and other treasures, melting down Aztec artifacts into ingots to ship back to Spain. Cortés also sought to undermine the Aztec religion. He and his men were appalled by the sacrifices carried out at the Templo Mayor and believed that their mission included spreading Christianity. Cortés ordered the placement of Christian images and crosses within temples, and on some occasions attempted to dismantle Aztec idols. While Montezuma tolerated some of these actions, they angered the Aztec nobility and priests, who viewed them as sacrilege. Aztec resistance begins to stir. The Aztec elites were growing restless. Montezuma's passive stance, seen by many as weakness or betrayal, led to murmurs of dissent. Some of the Aztec lords began to plot resistance against the foreign invaders. However, the Spaniards' possession of Montezuma complicated any open rebellion, as they feared that any uprising might cost the emperor his life. For his part, Montezuma appeared to be caught between two forces. Some historical accounts describe him as paralyzed by fear and superstition, believing the Spaniards were linked to divine forces. Others portray him as a shrewd politician, attempting to buy time while weighing his options. Whatever his motives, his indecisiveness proved fatal to the Aztec cause. The threat from Veracruz in the spring of 1520, Cortés received alarming news. A Spanish expedition led by Panfilo de Narvaez had landed at Veracruz. Sent by Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, Narvaez's mission was to arrest Cortés and take command of the expedition. Cortés, ever cunning, saw this as a threat not only to his authority but also to his very survival. Leaving a garrison of around 100 men under Pedro de Alvarado to guard Montezuma and maintain control of Tenochtitlan, Cortés marched to the coast with a small force to confront Narvaez. In a daring night attack, Cortés's men defeated Narvaez's much larger army and convinced many of Narvaez's soldiers to join them. With this victory, Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan with reinforcements and renewed confidence. The massacre at the Great Temple, while Cortés was away, events in Tenochtitlan took a disastrous turn. Pedro de Alvarado, known for his impulsiveness and brutality, grew suspicious that the Aztecs were planning an uprising during the festival of Toxcatl, dedicated to the god Tezcatlipoca. Without warning, Alvarado ordered a preemptive attack. During the festival, as the unarmed Aztec nobles and warriors danced and sang in the temple courtyard, Alvarado's men sealed off the exits and launched a massacre. Hundreds of Aztec nobles were slaughtered, their blood soaking the sacred plaza. This atrocity, known as the Massacre in the Great Temple, ignited outrage across the city. The Aztec revolt. When Cortés returned from Veracruz, he found Tenochtitlan an open rebellion. The people, enraged by the massacre, surrounded the Spanish quarters, cutting off supplies and attacking from all directions. The once hospitable city had become a trap. Cortés attempted to restore order by using Montezuma as a mediator. He brought the emperor to the balcony of the palace, hoping that his words would calm the crowd. Instead, the people turned on Montezuma, hurling stones and insults at him. According to Spanish accounts, Montezuma was struck in the head and gravely wounded, dying a few days later. Some Aztec sources, however, suggest that the Spaniards killed Montezuma when they realized he was no longer useful to them. Montezuma's death marked the end of an era. With their ruler gone, the Aztecs chose a new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, a capable and determined leader who immediately organized resistance against the invaders. The siege of the Spanish quarters. The Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies were now besieged inside Tenochtitlan. Aztec warriors launched relentless attacks, using canoes to strike from the lake and setting up barricades on the causeways. Cortés' men, though armed with superior weapons, were vastly outnumbered and suffered heavy casualties. Food and water ran low and morale plummeted. The Spaniards realized that they could not hold out much longer. Cortés devised a desperate plan. They would attempt to escape the city under cover of darkness, carrying as much of their treasure as they could. La Noche Triste, on the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards and their allies made their escape. They constructed makeshift portable bridges to cross the gaps where the Aztecs had removed planks from the causeways. However, the plan quickly unraveled. Aztec warriors discovered the retreat and launched a ferocious counterattack. Canoes swarmed the causeways, raining arrows and spears on the fleeing Spaniards. The heavy loads of gold and treasure slowed their movement, and many men, weighed down by their greed, drowned in the lake. The retreat turned into a chaotic massacre. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalans were killed. Horses and cannons were lost, and much of the gold Cortés had accumulated sank to the bottom of Lake Texcoco. This disastrous night became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Aftermath of La Noche Triste, Cortés and the survivors fled north toward Tlaxcala, pursued by Aztec forces. Exhausted, wounded, and demoralized, the Spanish forces seemed on the brink of destruction. Yet Cortés refused to give up. His resilience and leadership would prove critical in the months to come. The Aztecs celebrated their victory, believing they had driven out the invaders for good. However, they did not anticipate that Cortés would regroup, rebuild his forces, and return with even greater strength. The death of Cuauhtémoc, while the Aztecs rejoiced, disaster struck them in the form of a new and invisible enemy, smallpox. Introduced by one of Narvaez's soldiers, the disease swept through Tenochtitlan, killing tens of thousands. The Aztecs had no immunity to the European disease, and its effects were devastating. Entire families perished, and many warriors were left weakened or dead. Cuauhtémoc, the newly appointed emperor, succumbed to smallpox just a few months after La Noche Triste. His death further destabilized the Aztec leadership at a critical moment, paving the way for Cuauhtémoc, a young and determined warrior, to take the throne. Cortés regroups. By late 1520, Cortés had reached Tlaxcala, where he was received with compassion despite his disastrous defeat. The Tlaxcalans, seeing the Spanish as their only chance to break free from Aztec dominance, renewed their alliance. Cortés used this time to regroup, rebuild his army, and forge new alliances with other discontented city-states. He also learned from his mistakes. Cortés recognized that to defeat Tenochtitlan, he would need control of the lake surrounding the city. He began constructing brigantines, small ships that could be assembled and launched on Lake Texcoco, giving the Spanish and their allies naval superiority. The stage for final conquest. By the end of 1520, both sides were preparing for a final, decisive confrontation. The Aztec Empire, weakened by disease and internal turmoil, remained formidable but no longer invincible. Cortés, with his Tlaxcalan allies and a renewed sense of determination, was ready to launch a campaign that would bring about the siege and eventual fall of Tenochtitlan. Part 5. The Massacre, La Noche Triste, and the Battle of Atumba. The events following the massacre at the Great Temple and the bloody retreat known as La Noche Triste were a turning point in the conquest of the Aztec Empire. What had begun as a daring expedition led by a few hundred Spaniards now escalated into a full-scale war between the forces of Hernán Cortés, bolstered by thousands of indigenous allies, and the once mighty Aztec Empire. The period between mid-1520 and early 1521 was defined by devastation, shifting alliances, and a remarkable battle that saved the Spanish from complete annihilation. The aftermath of La Noche Triste. When the remnants of Cortés' force escaped Tenochtitlán on the night of June 30th, 1520, they were in a desperate state. Of the roughly 1,300 Spaniards who had entered the city, nearly half were dead, drowned, or captured. Thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies had also perished. Horses, cannons, and most of the treasure looted from the Aztecs were lost in the chaos. Exhausted and wounded, the survivors retreated along the causeway toward the mainland, pursued by Aztec warriors in canoes. Many men were killed in the waters of Lake Texcoco, and others were captured to be sacrificed at the Templo Mayor. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortés' soldiers, later wrote that they could hear the drums of the great temple and see the fires as their comrades were sacrificed, their hearts offered to the gods. Cortés, though badly shaken, refused to succumb to despair. He gathered his forces and pushed forward, knowing that if they stopped, they would be surrounded and destroyed. The march to Otumba, Cortés' immediate goal was to reach Tlaxcala, his most important ally. The route to Tlaxcala, however, led through the Otumba Plains, where a massive Aztec army awaited them. Cuauhtémoc, the new Aztec ruler after Cuitlahua death, had rallied his warriors to strike a decisive blow against the fleeing Spaniards. It was clear to both sides that the coming battle would determine the fate of the Spanish expedition. The Battle of Otumba on July 7, 1520, the Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies encountered a huge Aztec force, possibly numbering in the tens of thousands. The Spanish, outnumbered and weakened by exhaustion, faced what appeared to be certain destruction. Yet Cortés understood that the psychological impact of leadership and symbols was critical in Aztec warfare. During the fierce battle, the Spaniards used their cavalry and steel weapons to great effect, charging into enemy lines and breaking formations. However, the Aztec warriors continued to press forward, threatening to overwhelm the smaller Spanish force. In a desperate gamble, Cortés identified the Aztec commander, who carried a richly decorated banner that symbolized the army's leadership. Leading a small group of cavalry, Cortés charged through the Aztec ranks and struck down the commander, seizing the banner. Aztec forces, demoralized by the loss of their leader and standard, began to retreat. The victory at Otumba was a miraculous escape for Cortés and his men. Though still battered and diminished, they were able to continue their march to Tlaxcala, where they found refuge. The role of Tlaxcala, the Tlaxcalans, despite suffering heavy losses during La Noche Triste, welcomed Cortés and his men once again. The hatred between Tlaxcala and the Aztecs was so deep that the Tlaxcalans saw the Spanish defeat not as a reason to abandon the alliance, but as an opportunity to strike harder against their old enemies. Cortés spent several months in Tlaxcala recovering, rebuilding his forces, and forging new alliances. He sent emissaries to other city-states that resented Aztec rule, promising them freedom and autonomy in exchange for support. Many smaller polities saw the Spanish as a lesser evil compared to the Aztec demand for tribute and sacrifices. Rebuilding the Spanish forces, Cortés knew that to conquer Tenochtitlan, he needed to adapt his tactics. The city's location on an island surrounded by water made direct assaults difficult. He decided to construct a fleet of brigantines, small warships that could dominate the waters of Lake Texcoco. Spanish carpenters and indigenous laborers worked tirelessly to build the ships in Tlaxcala. The vessels were designed to be disassembled and transported overland to the lake. This innovative strategy would later give the Spanish control over the lake's waterways, cutting off Tenochtitlan's supplies and isolating the city. Aztec recovery and leadership of Cuauhtémoc. While courts regrouped, the Aztecs faced their own challenges. The death of Emperor Cuauhtémoc from smallpox in late 1520 left the empire reeling. Smallpox had killed thousands of warriors, nobles, and priests, severely weakening the social and military fabric of the empire. Into this chaos rose Cuauhtémoc, the young nephew of Montezuma. Barely in his 20s, Cuauhtémoc was a brave and determined leader who vowed to resist the Spanish to the end. He rallied the remaining Aztec forces, rebuilt defenses, and prepared Tenochtitlan for the inevitable siege. The role of disease, smallpox, introduced inadvertently by the Spaniards, proved to be one of their most devastating weapons. The epidemic not only killed large numbers of the Aztec population, but also created fear and social upheaval. Traditional religious practices were disrupted as priests and leaders died. Some survivors saw the disease as a sign that the gods had abandoned them, while others believed it was a punishment brought by the foreigners' gods. Courts, recognizing the impact of disease, used the epidemic to his advantage. With the Aztec population weakened, he could more easily persuade neighboring states to join his coalition. The Spanish returned to the Valley of Mexico by late 1520 and early 1521. Cortés was ready to return to the Valley of Mexico. His forces now numbered several hundred Spaniards, including reinforcements from Cuba and tens of thousands of indigenous allies from Tlaxcala and other city-states. As they marched toward Tenochtitlan, they systematically attacked Aztec strongholds and secured the surrounding towns. Cortés' strategy was clear. He would cut off Tenochtitlan from its allies and resources, then besiege the city until it fell. The siege of Tenochtitlan begins by April 1521. The Spanish and their allies had reached the shores of Lake Texcoco. The brigantines, now assembled and launched on the lake, gave the Spaniards control over the waterways. They used these ships to intercept canoes carrying food and supplies to the city, slowly starving Tenochtitlan. Cortés divided his forces and attacked along multiple causeways leading to the city. The fighting was fierce, with the Aztecs using every means at their disposal to repel the invaders' ambushes, barricades, and even attempts to capture Spanish soldiers alive for sacrifice. The battle for survival, the Aztecs fought with unmatched determination. Cuauhtémoc organized the defense with brilliant tactics, using canoes to strike at the brigantines and rebuilding causeways destroyed by the Spaniards. Women, children, and elders also played roles, carrying stones, repairing barricades, and providing food and water to the warriors. Yet, despite their courage, the Aztecs were gradually worn down. Spanish steel weapons and horses gave them a deadly edge in close combat, while indigenous allies overwhelmed the defenders with sheer numbers. A war of attrition, the siege dragged on for weeks, turning Tenochtitlan into a scene of unimaginable suffering. With the city cut off, food supplies dwindled. Starvation and disease spread rapidly. The once great capital, with its gleaming temples and bustling markets, became a place of desperation. Courts, aware of the suffering, used psychological warfare to break the Aztec spirit. Captured warriors were executed, and Spanish cannons bombarded the city's defenses. The Aztecs, however, continued to fight, refusing to surrender. The road to final conquest, the events of La Noche Triste and the victory at Otumba, had reshaped the conflict. The Spaniards were no longer mere adventurers, but the leaders of a vast coalition of indigenous forces united against the Aztec Empire. Meanwhile, the Aztecs, though brave, were isolated, weakened by disease, and beset by enemies on all sides. As the siege tightened, it became clear that the fall of Tenochtitlan was only a matter of time. The final chapter of the Aztec Empire's story would be written in the streets and canals of its great capital during the summer of 1521. Part 6. The Siege of Tenochtitlan and Final Conquest. The year 1521 marked the beginning of the end for the Aztec Empire. After the disaster of La Noche Triste, Hernán Cortés and his indigenous allies regrouped, strengthened their forces, and returned to the Valley of Mexico with a single goal: to destroy Tenochtitlan and overthrow the rule of Emperor Cuauhtémoc. What followed was one of the most brutal sieges in world history, a clash of cultures and armies that would bring down one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Americas. The coalition against the Aztecs. Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico in early 1521 at the head of a massive army. While the Spanish contingent numbered only about 800 soldiers, including around 80 cavalrymen and 13 cannons, his greatest strength lay in his alliances. Tens of thousands of warriors from Tlaxcala, Huachinango, Chalco, and other city-states that despised Aztec rule marched alongside him. These alliances were not formed solely from loyalty to the Spaniards. Many of the indigenous states saw Cortés as a tool to overthrow their Aztec oppressors, who for generations had extracted tribute, slaves, and sacrificial victims. By supporting the Spanish, they hoped to regain independence and avenge years of domination by Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan's defenses. Tenochtitlan was no ordinary city. Situated on an island in Lake Texcoco, it was connected to the mainland by 3 broad causeways, each lined with bridges that could be removed in times of war. The city was a labyrinth of canals, dikes, and stone buildings, making it an urban fortress. Its population, though ravaged by smallpox, still numbered in the tens of thousands, and its warriors were determined to defend their home to the last breath. Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor, displayed extraordinary courage and leadership. He organized defenses, stockpiled food and weapons, and ordered the construction of canoes to counter the Spanish brigantines that would soon dominate the lake. The launch of the brigantines. Cortés' boldest innovation was the construction of 13 brigantines, small but heavily armed ships designed to control Lake Texcoco. Built in Tlaxcala, these ships were disassembled, carried overland in pieces, and reassembled near the lake, a monumental logistical feat. When the brigantines were launched in May 1521, they immediately gave the Spaniards a crucial advantage. Armed with cannons and crossbows, the ships cut off Aztec canoes, intercepted supply lines, and allowed the Spanish to attack the city from all directions. The beginning of the siege. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in late May 1521. Cortés divided his forces into 3 main divisions, each attacking one of the major causeways. Pedro de Alvarado led forces along the Tacuba Causeway. Cristobal de Olid advanced along the Cayocan Causeway. Gonzalo de Sandoval moved along the Iztapalapa Causeway. Cortés himself commanded the brigantines on the lake, cutting off Aztec reinforcements and bombarding the city from the water. The fighting was brutal and relentless. Each day, the Spaniards and their allies advanced along the causeways, destroying Aztec defenses and filling in gaps with rubble to create solid paths for their horses and artillery. Each night, the Aztecs counterattacked, rebuilding barricades, launching ambushes, and harassing the invaders with arrows, spears, and sling stones. The Aztec counterattacks. The Aztecs were masters of the terrain. Using their canoes, they launched lightning strikes on Spanish positions, attempting to capture soldiers for sacrifice. Cuauhtémoc's warriors would lure the Spaniards deep into the city, then ambush them from rooftops and narrow streets. The Aztecs also devised traps, digging pits filled with sharp stakes along causeways and flooding certain areas to bog down horses and soldiers. The fighting often devolved into hand-to-hand combat, with obsidian-edged macuatl swords clashing against steel blades. Despite their ingenuity, the Aztecs could not match the firepower of Spanish cannons, crossbows, and firearms, nor could they stop the waves of allied warriors from Tlaxcala and other cities. The siege turns to starvation. As weeks turned into months, the siege began to take a heavy toll on the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish cut off all supply routes, preventing food and fresh water from reaching the city. Lake Texcoco, once a source of life, became a blockade zone patrolled by brigantines. Starvation and disease spread rapidly among the Aztec population. Corpses piled in the streets, and the once great city fell into despair. Yet, Cuauhtémoc and his warriors continued to fight, refusing to surrender even as their situation grew desperate. Destruction of the city, Cortés realized that he could not simply storm Tenochtitlan and claim victory. The Aztec defenses were too formidable. Instead, he adopted a strategy of systematic destruction. As his forces advanced, they razed entire districts, tearing down buildings and filling canals to create roads for cavalry and artillery. The Spaniards turned the city into rubble, block by block. This destruction horrified the Aztecs, who had built Tenochtitlan as a sacred city dedicated to their gods. Temples, markets, and palaces were reduced to ashes in the relentless advance. The capture of the Tlatelolco market, one of the key moments of the siege, came when the Spanish captured the Tlatelolco marketplace, the largest and most vital trading center in the city. This victory cut off a critical supply point and further demoralized the defenders. By this point, the Aztec resistance was collapsing, but Cuauhtémoc continued to fight on. Cuauhtémoc's final stand, by August 1521, after nearly 3 months of siege, Tenochtitlan was in ruins. Most of the population was dead from starvation, disease, or combat. Those who survived were too weak to continue fighting. Cuauhtémoc, however, refused to surrender and attempted to escape the city in a canoe, hoping to rally allies and continue resistance elsewhere. Cortés, anticipating this move, ordered his brigantines to patrol the lake. Cuauhtémoc was captured during this escape attempt, reportedly after being intercepted by Spanish ships. When brought before Cortés, the young emperor is said to have addressed him with dignity, asking the conqueror to end his life with a dagger rather than humiliate him. Cortés, impressed by Cuauhtémoc's bravery, spared him for the moment. The fall of Tenochtitlan on August 13, 1521, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan fell. The city was a smoldering ruin, its canals choked with bodies and debris. The once great empire of the Mexica was no more. Cortés entered the city as a conqueror, though what he found was not the wealth and splendor he had imagined, but devastation and death. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of Aztec political power. Yet, the Spanish conquest did not bring immediate peace. The Valley of Mexico was ravaged by war, disease, and famine for years to come. The fate of Cuauhtémoc. Cuauhtémoc remained a prisoner of the Spanish after the fall of the city. In 1525, during an expedition to Honduras, Cortés ordered his execution, allegedly fearing that the young leader was plotting a rebellion. Cuauhtémoc's death marked the symbolic end of Aztec resistance. Today, Cuauhtémoc is remembered as a hero and a symbol of courage and defiance. Statues of him stand across Mexico, honoring his determination to defend his people even in the face of overwhelming odds. The impact of the siege of Tenochtitlan, was catastrophic for the Aztec people. Historians estimate that the population of the Valley of Mexico, once numbering in the millions, was reduced by as much as 90% over the following decades due to warfare, disease, and forced labor. Entire neighborhoods and communities vanished, and the social fabric of the Aztec world was irreversibly shattered. For the Spaniards, the conquest opened the door to vast new territories and wealth. Cortés would go on to establish Mexico City on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, which became the capital of New Spain and a hub of Spanish colonial power. The legacy of the conquest, the fall of the Aztec Empire, was not merely the defeat of one kingdom by another. It was a collision of worlds, the encounter between European imperial ambitions and the rich civilizations of the Americas. The conquest combined military might, diplomacy, and devastating epidemics that reshaped the continent. For the indigenous peoples who allied with Cortés, the victory was bittersweet. While they were freed from Aztec tribute, they soon found themselves under Spanish colonial rule, subject to new forms of exploitation. The aftermath of victory after the fall, Cortés faced the challenge of consolidating his rule. He divided lands among his men, rebuilt infrastructure, and introduced Christianity through the efforts of missionaries. The Spanish began the process of spiritual conquest, converting temples into churches and erasing or attempting to erase indigenous religious practices. Yet the Aztec culture did not vanish. Much of it survived through oral traditions, codices, and the memories of the people. Today, the Nahuatl language, Aztec art, and even parts of their calendar remain important aspects of Mexican identity. Global consequences. The conquest of the Aztec Empire had global repercussions. It marked the beginning of Spanish dominance in the Americas, fueling the rise of the Spanish Empire as one of the most powerful nations in the world during the 16th century. The influx of gold and silver from Mexico and Peru reshaped the global economy, while the brutal realities of conquest inspired debates in Europe about the morality of empire and colonization. The siege of Tenochtitlan stands as one of history's most dramatic struggles, a story of courage, betrayal, ambition, and tragedy. It was not just a military defeat for the Aztecs, but the collapse of a worldview, a way of life that had flourished for centuries in the Valley of Mexico. Part 7, Aftermath and Legacy. The fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521 was not simply the conclusion of a military conquest. It marked the beginning of profound changes that would transform Mexico and the wider Americas for centuries to come. The destruction of Tenochtitlan was followed by a complex period of Spanish colonial rule, cultural blending, resistance, and the forging of new identities. Understanding the aftermath and legacy of the conquest reveals the lasting impact of this epical event. The immediate aftermath, rebuilding and colonization. After the conquest, Hernán Cortés set about establishing Spanish control over the Valley of Mexico. He rebuilt the ruined city of Tenochtitlan, founding Mexico City on its ruins, which quickly became the capital of New Spain, Spain's largest and wealthiest colony in the Americas. The Spanish imposed their political, religious, and economic systems. Aztec nobility were co-opted or replaced with Spanish officials, while indigenous leaders were often kept as intermediaries to maintain order. The encomienda system granted Spanish settlers rights to extract tribute and labor from indigenous populations, often leading to exploitation and harsh conditions. Demographic collapse. The conquest was followed by a catastrophic demographic collapse. The indigenous population, estimated at around 20 million in Mexico before contact, plummeted by as much as 90% within the following century. This decline was primarily caused by disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, and other old world diseases spread rapidly, decimating populations with no prior immunity. War, continued conflicts, rebellions, and forced military service contributed to deaths. Forced labor and harsh conditions. Many indigenous peoples were subjected to encomienda labor systems in mines and plantations, weakening communities further. Religious transformation. The Spanish conquest was also a spiritual conquest. Catholic missionaries, including Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, arrived with zeal to convert the indigenous peoples. Temples were destroyed or converted into churches. Indigenous religious practices were suppressed or syncretized with Catholic rituals. Despite repression, many indigenous beliefs and practices survived, often blending with Christian elements to create unique forms of religious expression. This syncretism remains a vital part of Mexican culture today. Cultural blending and mestizaje. The encounter between Spaniards and indigenous peoples led to significant cultural exchange and blending, known as mestizaje. Intermarriage, shared language, art, cuisine, and traditions gave rise to a mixed-race population that would become the foundation of modern Mexican identity. While mestizaje was often unequal and marked by Spanish dominance, indigenous influences persisted strongly in language, dress, food, and social customs. Resistance and rebellions. Though the Aztec political structure was dismantled, resistance continued. Indigenous uprisings occurred throughout the 16th century, including the Mixton War and the Chichimeca War, reflecting ongoing opposition to Spanish rule and exploitation. Some indigenous leaders, including descendants of Aztec nobility, sought to reclaim rights and preserve cultural traditions, negotiating their place within the colonial system. Historical memory and Aztec legacy. The legacy of the Aztecs survived in many ways. Language. Nahuatl remains spoken by over 1 million people in Mexico. Codices and manuscripts. Although many were destroyed, some Aztec codices survived, providing invaluable records of history, religion, and society. Architecture. Ruins like the Templo Mayor continue to reveal the grandeur of the Aztec civilization. Symbolism. The Mexican flag's emblem, the eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake, is derived from Aztec mythology about the founding of Tenochtitlan. Cuauhtémoc is remembered as a symbol of bravery and resistance. His story inspires pride in indigenous heritage and resilience. The conquest in global context. The fall of the Aztec Empire was part of the larger age of exploration and European imperial expansion. It signaled the opening of the Americas to European powers, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, and the creation of a global economy. Silver and gold from New Spain fueled European wealth and conflicts for centuries. The encounter also brought profound changes to ecosystems, diets, and populations worldwide in what scholars call the Columbian Exchange. Contemporary perspectives today. The conquest of the Aztecs is viewed through multiple lenses: historical tragedy, the destruction of a rich civilization, loss of life and cultural erasure, cultural resilience, survival and adaptation of indigenous peoples and traditions. Foundational moment, the creation of modern Mexico and Latin America's complex identities. Debates continue over figures like Hernán Cortés and La Malinche, who are seen variously as villains, heroes, or complex actors shaped by their time. The fall of the Aztec Empire remains one of the most dramatic stories in world history. From its height as a powerful empire to its sudden collapse under foreign invasion and disease, it represents the collision of worlds and the profound consequences of empire. Thank you for your watching. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Sweet dream.